Hello. Excuse me. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third installment of reading The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. This is the first book in his series, A Series of Unfortunate Events. I'm reading this in celebration of the new Netflix series that is coming out in January. So, we have read all the way through chapter 8, and so we have 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 left to read. So we're just going to power through. The format of this is a little different than my gaming streams in that feel free to chat. I want you guys to. However, I won't be able to respond until the end of each chapter. So, hello, Paige. Welcome. Welcome. I'm glad you could be here. I'm still kind of a little phlegmy, if you'll forgive me, so I have some beverages to kind of keep myself hydrated, and we're gonna keep this going. All right. All right. Chapter 9. Yes, Count Olaf continued. It certainly is strange to find a child missing, and one so small and helpless. Where's Sunny? Violet cried. What have you done with her? Count Olaf continued to speak as if he had not heard Violet. But then again, one sees strange things every day. In fact, if you two orphans follow me out to the backyard, I think we will see something rather unusual. The Baudelaire children didn't say anything, but followed Count Olaf through the house and out the back door. Violet looked around the small, scraggly yard in which she had not been since she and Klaus had been forced to chop wood. The pile of logs they had made was still lying there untouched, as if Count Olaf had merely made them chop logs for his own amusement rather than for any purpose. Violet shivered still in her nightgown, but as she gazed here and there, she saw nothing unusual. You're not looking in the right place, Count Olaf said. For children who read so much, you two are remarkably unintelligent. Violet looked over in the direction of Count Olaf, but she could not meet his eyes. The eyes on his face, that is. She was staring at his feet and could see the tattooed eye that had been watching the Baudelaire orphans since their troubles had begun. Then her eyes traveled up Count Olaf's lean, shabbily dressed body, and she saw that he was pointing up with one scrawny hand. She followed his gesture and found herself looking at the forbidden tower. It was made of dirty stone with only one lone window, and just barely visible in the window was what looked like a bird cage. Oh no, Klaus said in a small, scared voice, and Violet looked again. It was a bird cage, dangling from the tower window like a flag in the wind, but inside the bird cage she could see a small and frightened Sunny. When Violet looked closely, she could see that there was a large piece of tape across her sister's mouth and ropes around her body. She was utterly trapped. Let her go, Violet said to Count Olaf. She's done nothing to you. She's an infant. Well now, Count Olaf said, sitting on a stump. If you really want me to let her go, I will, but surely even a stupid brat like you might realize that if I let her go, or more accurately, if I ask my comrade to let her go, poor little Sunny might not survive the fall down to the ground. That's a 30-foot tower, which is a very long way for a very little person to fall, even when she's inside a cage. But if you insist— No! Klaus cried. Don't. Violet looked into Count Olaf's eyes and then at the small parcel that was her sister hanging from the top of the tower and moving slowly into the breeze. She pictured Sunny toppling from the tower and onto the ground, pictured her sister's last thoughts being ones of sheer terror. Please, she said to Olaf, feeling tears in her eyes. She's just a baby. We'll do anything, just don't harm her. Anything? Count Olaf asked, his eyebrow rising. He leaned in toward Violet and gazed into her eyes. Anything. Would you, for instance, consider marrying me during tomorrow night's performance? Violet stared at him. She had an odd feeling in her stomach, as if she were the one being thrown from a great height. The really frightening thing about Olaf, she realized, was that he was very smart after all. He wasn't merely an unsavory drunken brute, but an unsavory, clever drunken brute. While you were busy reading books and making accusations, Count Olaf said, I had one of my quietest, sneakiest assistants skulk into your bedroom and steal little Sunny away. She's perfectly safe for now, but I consider her to be a stick behind a stubborn mule." "Our sister is not a stick," Klaus said. "A stubborn mule," Count Olaf explained, "does not move in the direction its owner wants it to. In that way, it is like you children, who insist on mucking up my plans. Any animal owner will tell you that a stubborn mule will move in the proper direction if there is a carrot in front of it and a stick behind it. It will move toward the carrot because it wants the reward of food, and away from the stick because it does not want the punishment of pain. Likewise, you will do what I say, to avoid the punishment of the loss of your sister, and because you want the reward of surviving this experience. Now, Violet, let me ask you again. Will you marry me?" Violet swallowed and looked down at Count Olaf's tattoo. She could not bring herself to answer. "Come now," Count Olaf said, his voice faking, a word which here means feigning, kindness. He reached out a hand and stroked Violet's hair. "Would it be so terrible to be my bride? To live in my house for the rest of your life? You're such a lovely girl. After the marriage, I wouldn't dispose of you like your brother and sister." Violet imagined sleeping beside Count Olaf and waking up each morning to look at this terrible man. She pictured wandering around the house trying to avoid him all day and cooking for his terrible friends at night, perhaps every night for the rest of her life. But then she looked up at her helpless sister and knew what her answer must be. "If you let Sonny go," she said finally, "I will marry you." "I will let Sonny go," Count Olaf answered, "after tomorrow night's performance. In the meantime, she will remain in the tower for safekeeping, and as a warning, I will tell you that my assistants will stand guard at the door to the tower staircase in case you were getting any ideas." "You're a terrible man," Klaus spat out, but Count Olaf merely smiled again. "I may be a terrible man," Count Olaf said, "but I have been able to concoct a foolproof way of getting your fortune, which is more than you've been able to do." With that, he began to stride toward the house. "Remember that, orphans," he said. "You may have read more books than I have, but it didn't help you gain the upper hand in this situation. Now give me that book which gave you such grand ideas, and do the chores assigned to you." Klaus sighed and relinquished, a word which here means gave to Count Olaf even though he didn't want to, the book on nuptial law. He began to follow Count Olaf into the house, but Violet stayed still as a statue. She hadn't been listening to that last part of Count Olaf's speech, knowing that it would be full of the usual self-congratulatory nonsense and despicable insults. She was staring at the tower, not at the top where her sister was dangling, but the whole length of it. Klaus looked back at her and saw something he hadn't seen in quite some time. To those who hadn't been around Violet long, nothing would have seemed unusual, but those who knew her well knew that when she tied her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes, it meant that the gears and levers of her inventing brain were whirring at top speed. That's the end of chapter 9. Hi, Paige. Sorry for throwing you into the middle of this book with no context. And Holland, thanks for stopping by for a quick minute. All right. Chapter 10. That night, Klaus was the Baudelaire orphan sleeping fitfully in the bed, and Violet was the Baudelaire orphan staying up, working by the light of the moon. All day the two siblings had wandered around the house, doing the assigned chores and scarcely speaking to each other. Klaus was too tired and despondent to speak, and Violet was holed up in the inventing area of her mind, too busy planning to talk. When night approached, Violet gathered up the curtains that had been Sonny's bed and brought them to the door to the tower stairs, where the enormous assistant of Count Olaf's, the one that looked like neither a man nor a woman, was standing guard. Violet asked whether she could bring the blankets to her sister to make her more comfortable during the night. The enormous creature merely looked at Violet with its blank white eyes and shook its head, then dismissed her with a silent gesture. Violet knew, of course, that Sonny was too terrified to be comforted by a handful of draperies, but she hoped that she would be allowed a few minutes to hold her and tell her that everything would turn out all right. Also, she wanted to do something known in the crime industry as casing the joint. Casing the joint means observing a particular location in order to formulate a plan. For instance, if you are a bank robber, although I hope you aren't, you might go to the bank for a few days before you plan to rob it. Perhaps wearing a disguise, you would look around the bank and observe security guards, cameras, and other obstacles, so you could plan how to avoid capture or death during your burglary. Violet, a law-abiding citizen, was not planning to rob a bank, but she was planning to rescue Sunny and was hoping to catch a glimpse of the tower room in which her sister was being held prisoner, so as to make her plan more easily. But it appeared that she wasn't going to be able to case the joint after all. This made Violet nervous as she sat on the floor by the window, working on her invention as quietly as she could. Violet had very few materials with which to invent something, and she didn't want to wander around the house looking for more for fear of arousing the suspicions of Count Olaf and his troop. But she had enough to build a rescuing device. Above the window was a sturdy metal rod from which the curtains had hung, and Violet took it down. Using one of the rocks Olaf had left in a pile in the corner, she broke the curtain rod into 2 pieces. She then bent each piece of the rod into several sharp angles, leaving tiny cuts on her hands as she did so. Then Violet took down the painting of the eye. On the back of the painting, as on the back of many paintings, was a small piece of wire to hang on the hook. She removed the wire and used it to connect the 2 pieces together. Violet had now made what looked like a large metal spider. She then went over to the cardboard box and took out the ugliest of the clothes that Mrs. Poe had purchased, the outfits the Baudelaire orphans would never wear no matter how desperate they were. Working quickly and quietly, she began to tear these into long, narrow strips and to tie these strips together. Among Violet's many useful skills was a vast knowledge of different types of knots. This particular knot she was using was called the devil's tongue. A group of female Finnish pirates invented it back in the 15th century and named it the devil's tongue because it twisted this way and that in the most complicated and eerie way. The devil's tongue was a very useful knot, and when Violet tied the cloth strips together end to end, it formed a sort of rope. As she worked, she remembered something her parents had said to her when Klaus was born, and again when they brought Sunny home from the hospital. "You are the eldest Baudelaire child," they had said kindly but firmly, "and as the eldest, it will always be your responsibility to look after your younger siblings. Promise us that you will always watch out for them, and make sure they don't get into trouble." Violet remembered her promise, and thought of Klaus, whose bruised face still looked sore, and Sunny dangling from the top of the tower like a flag, and began working faster. Even though Count Olaf was of course the cause of all this misery, Violet felt as if she had broken her promise to her parents and vowed to make it right. Eventually, using enough of the ugly clothing, Violet had a rope that was, she hoped, just over 30 feet long. She tied one end of it to the metal spider and looked at her handiwork. What she had made was called a grappling hook, which is something used for climbing up the sides of buildings, usually for a nefarious purpose. Using the metal end to hook onto something at the top of the tower, and the rope to aid her climb, Violet hoped to reach the top of the tower, untie Sunny's cage, and climb back down. This was, of course, a very risky plan, both because it was dangerous and because she had made the grappling hook herself instead of purchasing it at a store that sold such things. But a grappling hook was all Violet could think of to make without a proper inventing laboratory, and time was running short. She hadn't told Klaus about her plan because she didn't want to give him false hope, so without waking him, she gathered up her grappling hook and tiptoed out of the room. Once outside, Violet realized her plan was even more difficult than she'd thought. The night was quiet, which means she would have to make practically no noise at all. The night also had a slight breeze, and when she pictured herself swinging in the breeze, clinging to a rope made of ugly clothing, she almost gave up entirely. And the night was dark, so it was hard to see where she could toss the grappling hook and have the metal arms hook onto something. But standing there shivering in her nightgown, Violet knew she had to try. Using her right hand, she threw the grappling hook as high and as hard as she could and waited to see if it would catch on to something. Clang! The hook made a loud noise as it hit the tower, but it didn't stick to anything and came crashing back down. Her heart pounding, Violet stood stock still, wondering if Count Olaf or one of his accomplices would come and investigate. But nobody arrived after a few moments, and Violet, swinging the hook over her head like a lasso, tried again. Clang! Clang! The grappling hook hit the tower twice as it bounced back down to the ground. Violet waited again, listening for footsteps, but all she heard was her own terrified pulse. She decided to try one more time. Clang! The grappling hook hit the tower and fell down again, hitting Violet hard in the shoulder. One of the arms tore her nightgown and cut through her skin. Biting down on her hand to keep from crying out in pain, Violet felt the place in her shoulder where she had been struck, and it was wet with blood. Her arm throbbed in pain. At this point in the proceedings, if I were Violet, I would have given up. But just as she was about to turn around and go inside the house, she pictured how scared Sunny must be, and ignoring the pain in her shoulder, Violet used her right hand to throw the hook again. Clang! The usual clang sound stopped halfway through, and Violet saw in the dim light of the moon that the hook wasn't falling. Nervously, she gave the rope a good yank, and it stayed put. The grappling hook had worked! Her feet touching the side of the stone tower and her hands grasping the rope, Violet closed her eyes and began to climb. Never daring to look around, she pulled herself up the tower, hand over hand, all the time keeping in mind her promise to her parents and the horrible things Count Olaf would do if his villainous plan worked. The evening wind blew harder and harder as she climbed higher and higher, and several times Violet had to stop climbing as the rope moved in the wind. She was certain that at any moment the cloth would tear or the hook would slip, and Violet would be sent tumbling to her death. But thanks to her adroit inventing skills, the word adroit here means skillful, everything worked the way it was supposed to work, and suddenly Violet found herself feeling a piece of metal instead of a cloth rope. She opened her eyes and saw her sister Sunny, who was looking at her frantically and trying to say something past the strip of tape. Violet had arrived at the top of the tower, right at the window where Sunny was tied. The eldest Baudelaire orphan was about to grab her sister's cage and make her descent when she saw something that made her stop. It was the spidery end of the grappling hook, which after several attempts had finally stuck onto something in the tower. Violet had guessed during her climb that it had found some notch in the stone or part of the window or perhaps a piece of furniture inside the tower room, and stuck there. But that wasn't what the hook had stuck on. Violet's grappling hook had stuck on another hook. It was one of the hooks on the hook-handed man. And his other hook, Violet saw, was glinting in the moonlight as it reached right toward her. Oh, this is my favorite series of books, Paige. I hope you end up reading them sometime, or let me read them to you. Chapter 11. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-handed man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her into the tower room, and with a flick of his hook, sent her rescue device clanging to the ground. Now Violet was as trapped as her sister. I'm so glad you're here, the hook-handed man said. I was just thinking how much I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat. What are you going to do with me? Violet asked. I said have a seat, the hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into a chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. I'm certain that over the course of your own life, you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion on which I can play a few sad songs, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Baudelaire orphans, and a blurry photograph, taken a long time ago, of a woman whose name is Beatrice. These are items that are very precious and dear to me. The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf, and they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas in an illegible scrawl, lying in messy piles on top of the copy of Nuptial Law he had taken away from Klaus. There were a few chairs and a handful of candles which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor were empty wine bottles and dirty dishes, but most of all were the drawings and paintings and carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceilings and scratched into the grimy wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled along the windowsill, and one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairs. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into a pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pressed a button and waited a moment. Boss, it's me, he said. Your blushing bride just climbed up here to try to rescue the biting brat. He paused as Count Olaf said something. I don't know, with some sort of rope. It was a grappling hook, said Violet, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. I made it myself. She says it was a grappling hook, the hook-handed man said into the walkie-talkie. I don't know, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss, of course I understand she's yours. Yes, boss. He pressed a button to disconnect the line, then turned to face Violet. Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride. I'm not his bride, Violet said bitterly. Very soon you will be, the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook the way most people would wag a finger. In the meantime, however, I have to go and fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way Count Olaf can be sure you will all stay out of mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him, and then listened to his footsteps fading away down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister in fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about, Count Olaf's wrath, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything was all right. But of course everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of morning trickled into the tower room, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had experienced recently. Their parents had died suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had brought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help them. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Baudelaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library and failed. Poor Sunny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sunny and found herself captured as well. All in all, the Baudelaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable, a phrase which here means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, confused, and scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hook-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I will have to tie you up and let you dangle out of the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "What happened?" he asked Violet. "Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sunny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb up the tower." Klaus went over to the window and looked down at the ground. "It's so high up," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as the thought of marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her sore shoulder. "I just got caught, and now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'd keep us here until tonight, and then it's the marvelous marriage." "Do you think you could invent something that would help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," Violet said. "And why don't you go through those books and papers? Perhaps there's some information that could be of use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room in their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects with which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sunny and smile at her and pat her head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their own thoughts. "If we had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, "I could make Molotov cocktails with those bottles." "What are Molotov cocktails?" Klaus asked. "They're small bombs made inside bottles," Violet explained. "We could throw them out the window and attract the attention of passers-by." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said mournfully. They were silent for several hours. "If we were polygamists," Klaus said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus asked. "In this community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they've married in the presence of a judge, with the statement of I do and the signed document in their own hand. I've read that in nuptial law." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. They were silent for several more hours. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid that Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say, I don't, instead of I do," Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sunny dropped off the tower." "I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked as shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved a hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It is time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room, and we will keep in constant contact through our walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong during tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death. Come along now." Violet and Klaus looked at each other, and then at Sunny, still dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the tower stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart as all hope left him. There truly seemed to be no way out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way, until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door, and the short walk down the block to the theater, Violet thought and thought and thought, harder than she had in her entire life. That's the end of chapter 11. So many books, so little time. That's so true. Yes, I'm planning on finishing the book today. There's just 2 more chapters. Yay, bombs! Yay, polygamy! This book is basically a vocabulary for children. Vocabulary lesson for children. But, I love it anyway! Chapter 12. As Violet and Klaus Baudelaire stood, still in their nightgown and pajamas, backstage at Count Olaf's theater, they were of 2 minds. A phrase which here means they felt 2 different ways at the same time. On one hand, they were of course filled with dread. From the murmur of voices they heard on the stage, the 2 Baudelaire orphans could tell that the performance of the marvelous marriage had begun, and it seemed too late to do anything to foil Count Olaf's plan. On the other hand, however, they were fascinated, as they'd never been backstage at a theatrical production, and there was so much to see. Members of Count Olaf's theater troupe hurried this way and that, too busy to even glance at the children. Ow. 3 very short men were carrying a large flat piece of wood, painted to look like a living room. The 2 white-faced women were arranging flowers in a vase that from far away appeared to be the marble, but close up looked more like cardboard. An important-looking man with warts all over his face was adjusting enormous light fixtures. As the children peeked on stage, they could see Count Olaf in his fancy suit declaiming some lines from the play. Just as the curtain came down, controlled by a woman with very short hair who was pulling on a long rope attached to a pulley. Despite their fear, you see, the 2 elder Baudelaires were very interested in what was going on, and only wished that they were not involved in some way. As the curtain fell, Count Olaf strode off stage and looked at the children. "It's the end of Act 2! Why aren't the orphans in their costumes?" he hissed to the 2 white-faced women. Then as the audience broke into applause, his angry expression turned to one of joy, and he walked back on stage. Gesturing to the short-haired woman to raise the curtain, he strode to the exact center of the stage and took elaborate bows as the curtain came up. He waved and blew kisses to the audience as the curtain came down again, and then his face once again filled with anger. "Intermission is only 10 minutes, he said, and then the children must perform. Get them into costumes quickly." Without a word, the 2 white-faced women grabbed Violet and Klaus by the wrists and led them into the dressing room. The room was dusty but shiny, covered in mirrors and tiny lights so the actors could see better to put on their makeups and wigs, and there were people calling out one to another and laughing as they changed their clothes. One of the white-faced women yanked Violet's arms up and pulled her nightgown off over her head and thrust a dirty, lacy white dress at her to put on. Klaus, meanwhile, had his pajamas removed by the other white-faced woman and was hurriedly stuffed into a blue sailor suit that itched and made him look like a toddler. "Isn't this exciting?" said a voice, and the children turned to see Justice Strauss, all dressed up in her judge's robes and powdered wig. She was clutching a small book. "You children look wonderful." "So do you," Klaus said. "What's that book?" "Why, those are my lines," Justice Strauss said. "Count Olaf told me to bring a law book and read the real wedding ceremony in order to make the play as realistic as possible. All you have to say, Violet, is I do, but I have to make quite a speech. This is going to be such fun." "You know what would be fun," Violet said carefully, "is if you changed your lines around just a little." Klaus's face lit up. "Yes, Justice Strauss, be creative. There's no reason to stick to the legal ceremony. It's not as if it's a real wedding." Justice Strauss frowned. "I don't know about that, children," she said. "I think it would be best to follow Count Olaf's instructions. After all, he's in charge." "Justice Strauss!" a voice called. "Justice Strauss, please report to the makeup artist." "Oh, my word, I get to wear makeup." Justice Strauss had on a dreamy expression as if she were about to be crowned queen, instead of just having some powders and cream smeared on her face. "Children, I must go. See you on stage, my dears." Justice Strauss ran off, leaving the children to finish changing into their costumes. One of the white-faced women put on a flowered headdress on Violet, who realized in horror that the dress she had changed into was a bridal gown. The other woman put a sailor cap on Klaus, who gazed in one of the mirrors, astonished at how ugly he looked. His eyes met those of Violet, who was looking in the mirror as well. "What can we do?" Klaus said quietly. "Pretend to be sick? Maybe they'd call off the performance?" "Count Olaf would know what we were up to," Violet replied glumly. "Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage by Al Funcoot is about to begin," a man with a clipboard shouted. "Everyone, please get in your places for Act 3. The actors rushed out of the room, and the white-faced woman grabbed the children and hustled them out after them. The backstage area was in complete pandemonium, a word which here means actors and stagehands running around attending to last-minute details. The bald man with the long nose hurried by the children, then stopped himself, looked at Violet in her wedding dress, and smirked. "No funny stuff," he said to them, waggling a bony finger. "Remember when you go out there, just do exactly what you're supposed to do. Count Olaf will be holding his walkie-talkie during the entire act, and even if you do one thing wrong, he'll be giving Sonny a call up there in the tower." "Yes, yes," Klaus said bitterly. He was tired of being threatened in the same way over and over. "You better do exactly as planned," the man said again. "I'm sure they will," said a voice suddenly, and the children turned to see Mr. Poe, dressed very formally and accompanied by his wife. He smiled at the children and came over to shake their hands. "Polly and I just wanted to tell you to break a leg." "What?" Klaus said, alarmed. "That's a theater term," Mr. Poe explained, "meaning good luck on tonight's performance. I'm glad that you children have adjusted to life with your new father and are participating in family activities." "Mr. Poe," Klaus said quickly, "Violet and I have something to tell you. It's very important." "What is it?" Mr. Poe said. "Yes," said Count Olaf. "What is it you have to tell Mr. Poe, children?" Count Olaf had appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and his shiny eyes glared at the children meaningfully. In one hand, Violet and Klaus could see he held a walkie-talkie. "Just that we appreciate all you've done for us, Mr. Poe," Klaus said weakly. "That's all we wanted to say." Of course," Mr. Poe said, patting him on the back. "Well, Polly and I had better take our seats. Break a leg, Baudelaires." "I wish we could break a leg," Klaus whispered to Violet, and Mr. Poe left. "You will soon enough," Count Olaf said, pushing the two children toward the stage. Other actors were milling about, finding their places for Act 3, and Justice Strauss was off in a corner, practicing her lines from her law book. Klaus took a look around the stage, wondering if anyone there could help. The bald man with the long nose took Klaus's hand and led him to one side. "You and I will stand here for the duration of the act. That means the whole thing." "I know what the word duration means," Klaus said. "No nonsense," the bald man said. Klaus watched his sister in her wedding gown take her place next to Count Olaf as the curtain rose. Klaus heard applause from the audience as Act 3 of The Marvelous Marriage began. It will be no interest to you if I describe the action of this insipid, the word insipid here means dull and foolish, play by Al Funcoot, because it was a dreadful play and of no real importance to our story. Various actors and actresses performed very dull dialogue and moved about the set, as Klaus tried to make eye contact with them and see if they would help. He soon realized that this play must have been chosen merely as an excuse for Olaf's evil plan and not for its entertainment value, as he sensed the audience losing interest in moving around in their seats. Klaus turned his attention to the audience to see whether any of them would notice that something was afoot, but the way the wart-faced man had arranged the lights prevented Klaus from seeing the faces in the auditorium, and he could only make out the dim outlines of the people in the audience. Count Olaf had a great number of very long speeches, which he performed with elaborate gestures and facial expressions. No one seemed to notice that he held a walkie-talkie the entire time. Finally, Justice Strauss began speaking, and Klaus saw that she was reading directly from the legal book. Her eyes were sparkling and her face flushed as she performed on stage for the first time, too stage-struck to realize she was part of Olaf's plan. She spoke on and on about Olaf and Violet caring for each other in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, and all of those things that are said to many people who decide for one reason or another to get married. When she finished her speech, Justice Strauss turned to Count Olaf and said, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Count Olaf said, smiling. Klaus saw Violet shudder. "Do you," Justice Strauss said, turning to Violet, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Violet said. Klaus clenched his fists. His sister had said "I do" in the presence of a judge. Once she'd signed the official document, the wedding was legally valid, and now Klaus could see that Justice Strauss was taking the document from one of the other actors and holding it out to Violet to sign. "Don't move an inch," the bald man muttered to Klaus, and Klaus thought of poor Sonny dangling at the top of the tower and stood still as he watched Violet take a long quill pen from Count Olaf. Violet's eyes were wide as she looked down at the document, and her face was pale, and her left hand was trembling as she signed her name. Just one chapter to go! Let's finish this sucker. Chapter 13. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Count Olaf said, stepping forward to address the audience, I have an announcement. There is no reason to continue tonight's performance, for its purpose has been served. This has not been a scene of fiction. My marriage to Violet Baudelaire is perfectly legal, and now I am in control of her entire fortune. There were gasps from the audience, and some of the actors looked at one another in shock. Not everyone apparently had known about Olaf's plan. That can't be, Justice Strauss cried. The marriage laws in this community are quite simple, Count Olaf said. The bride must say I do in the presence of a judge like yourself and sign an explanatory document. And all of you, here Count Olaf gestured out to the audience, are witnesses. But Violet is only a child, one of the actors said. She's not old enough to marry. She is if her legal guardian agrees, Count Olaf said. And in addition to being her husband, I am her legal guardian. But that piece of paper is not an official document, Justice Strauss said. That's just a stage prop. Count Olaf took the paper from Violet's hand and gave it to Justice Strauss. I think if you look at it closely, you will see it is an official document from City Hall. Justice Strauss took the document in her hand and read it quickly. Then, closing her eyes, she sighed deeply and furrowed her brow, thinking hard. Klaus watched her and wondered if this were the expression Justice Strauss had on her face whenever she was serving on the High Court. You're right, she said finally to Count Olaf. This marriage, unfortunately, is completely legal. Violet said I do and signed her name here on the paper. Count Olaf, you are Violet's husband and therefore in complete control of her estate. That can't be, said a voice from the audience, and Klaus recognized it as the voice of Mr. Poe. He ran up the stairs to the stage and took the document from Justice Strauss. This is dreadful nonsense. I'm afraid this dreadful nonsense is the law, Justice Strauss said. Her eyes were filling up with tears. I can't believe how easily I was tricked, she said. I would never do anything to harm you children, never. You were easily tricked, Count Olaf said, grinning, and the judge began to cry. It was child's play winning this fortune. Now, if all of you will excuse me, my bride and I need to go home for our wedding night. First let Sunny go, Klaus burst out. You promised to let her go. Where is Sunny? Mr. Poe asked. She's all tied up at the moment, Count Olaf said, if you'll pardon a little joke. His eyes shone as he pressed buttons on the walkie-talkie and waited while the hook-handed man answered. Hello? Yes, of course it's me, you idiot. Everything's gone according to plan. Please remove Sunny from her cage and bring her directly to the theater. Klaus and Sunny have some chores to do before they go to bed. Count Olaf gave Klaus a sharp look. Are you satisfied now? He asked. Yes, Klaus said quietly. He wasn't satisfied at all, of course, but at least his baby sister was no longer dangling from a tower. Don't think you're so safe, the bald man whispered to Klaus. Count Olaf will take care of you and your sisters later. He doesn't want to do it in front of all these people. He did not have to explain to Klaus what he meant by the phrase take care of. Well, I'm not satisfied at all, Mr. Poe said. This is absolutely horrendous. This is completely monstrous. This is financially dreadful. I'm afraid, however, Count Olaf said, that it is legally binding. Tomorrow, Mr. Poe, I shall come down to the bank and withdraw the complete Baudelaire fortune. Mr. Poe opened his mouth as if to say something, but began to cough instead. For several seconds he coughed into a handkerchief while everyone waited for him to speak. I won't allow that, Mr. Poe finally gasped, wiping his mouth. I absolutely will not allow it. I'm afraid you have to, Count Olaf replied. I'm afraid Olaf is right, Justice Strauss said through her tears. This marriage is legally binding. Begging your pardon, Violet said suddenly, but I think you might be wrong. Everyone turned to look at the eldest Baudelaire orphan. What did you say, Countess? Olaf said. I'm not your Countess, Violet said testily, a word which here means in an extremely annoyed tone. At least I don't think I am. And why is that? Count Olaf said. I did not sign the document in my own hand as the law states, Violet said. What do you mean? We all saw you. Count Olaf's eyebrow was beginning to rise in anger. I'm afraid your husband is right, dear, Justice Strauss said sadly. There's no use denying it. There's too many witnesses. Like most people, Violet said, I'm right-handed. but I signed that document with my left hand." "What?" Count Olaf cried. He snatched the paper from Justice Strauss and looked down at it. His eyes were shining very bright. "You are a liar!" he hissed at Violet. "No, she's not," Klaus said excitedly. "I remember because I watched her left hand trembling as she signed her name." "That's impossible to prove," Count Olaf said. "If you like," Violet said, "I'd be happy to sign my name again on a separate sheet of paper with my right hand and then with my left. Then we can see which signature the one on the document most resembles." "A small detail like which hand you use to sign," Count Olaf said, "doesn't matter in the least." "If you don't mind, sir," Mr. Poe said, "I'd like Justice Strauss to make that decision." Everyone looked at Justice Strauss, who was wiping away the last of her tears. "Let me see," she said quietly, and closed her eyes again. She sighed deeply, and the Baudelaire orphans, and all who liked them, held their breath as Justice Strauss furrowed her brow, thinking hard on the situation. Finally she smiled. "If Violet is indeed right-handed," she said carefully, "and she signed the document with her left hand, then it follows that the signature does not fulfill the requirements of the nuptial law. The law clearly states the document must be signed in the bride's own hand. Therefore, we can conclude that this marriage is invalid. Violet, you are not a countess, and Count Olaf, you are not in control of the Baudelaire fortune." "Hooray!" cried a voice from the audience, and several people applauded. "Unless you are a lawyer, it will probably strike you as odd that Count Olaf's plan was defeated by Violet signing with her left hand instead of her right, but the law is an odd thing. For instance, one country in Europe has a law that requires all of its bakers to sell bread at the exact same price. A certain island has a law that forbids anyone from removing its fruit, and a town not too far from where you live has a law that bars me from coming within 5 miles of its borders. Had Violet signed the marriage contract with her right hand, the law would have made her a miserable Contessa, but because she signed it with her left, she remained to her relief a miserable orphan." What was good news to Violet and her siblings, of course, was bad news to Count Olaf. Nevertheless, he gave everyone a grim smile. "In that case," he said to Violet, pushing a button on the walkie-talkie, "you will either marry me again, and correctly this time, or I will—" "Nepo!" Sunny's unmistakable voice rang out over Count Olaf's as she tottered on stage toward her siblings. The hook-handed man followed behind her, his walkie-talkie buzzing and crackling. Count Olaf was too late. "Sunny, you're safe," Klaus said, and embraced her. Violet rushed over, and the two older Baudelaires fussed over the youngest one. "Somebody bring her something to eat," Violet said. "She must be very hungry after hanging in a tower window all that time." "Cake!" Sunny shrieked. "Ah!" Count Olaf roared. He began to pace back and forth like an animal in a cage, pausing only to point a finger at Violet. "You may not be my wife," he said, "but you are still my daughter. And do you honestly think," Mr. Poe said in an exasperated voice, "that I will allow you to continue to care for these 3 children after the treachery I've seen here tonight?" "The orphans are mine," Count Olaf insisted, "and with me they shall stay. There's nothing illegal about trying to marry someone." "There is something illegal about dangling an infant out of a tower window," Justice Strauss said indignantly. "You, Count Olaf, will go to jail, and 3 children will live with me." "Arrest him!" a voice cried from the audience, and other people took up the cry. "Send him to jail! He's an evil man! And give us our money back! It was a lousy play!" Mr. Poe took Count Olaf's arm, and after a brief eruption of coughs, announced in a harsh voice, "I hereby arrest you in the name of the law." "Oh, Justice Strauss," Violet said, "did you really mean what you said? Can we really live with you?" "Of course I mean it," Justice Strauss said. "I'm very fond of you children, and I feel responsible for your welfare." "Can we use your library every day?" Klaus asked. "Can we work in the garden?" Violet asked. "Cake!" Sunny shrieked again, and everyone laughed. At this point in the story, I feel obliged to interrupt and give you one last warning. As I said at the very beginning, the book you are holding in your hands does not have a happy ending. It may appear now that Count Olaf will go to jail and that the 3 Baudelaire youngsters will live happily ever after with Justice Strauss, but it is not so. If you like, you may shut the book this instant and not read the unhappy ending that is to follow. You may spend the rest of your life believing that the Baudelaires triumphed over Count Olaf and live the rest of their lives in the house and library of Justice Strauss, but that is not how the story goes. For as everyone was laughing at Sunny's cry for cake, the important-looking man with all the warts on his face was sneaking toward the controls for the lighting of the theater. Quick as a wink, the man flicked the main switch so that all the lights went off and everyone was standing in darkness. Instantly, pandemonium ensued as everyone ran this way and that, shouting at one another. Actors tripped over members of the audience tripped over theatrical props. Mr. Poe grabbed his wife, thinking it was Count Olaf. Klaus grabbed Sunny and held her up as high as he could so she wouldn't get hurt, but Violet knew at once what had happened and made her way carefully to where she remembered the lights had been. When the play was being performed, Violet had watched the light controls carefully, taking mental notes in case these devices came in handy for an invention. She was certain that if she could find the switch, she could turn it back on. Her arms stretched in front of her as if she were blind, Violet made her way across the stage, stepping carefully around pieces of furniture and startled actors. In the darkness, Violet looked like a ghost, her white wedding gown moving slowly across the stage. Then, just as she had reached the switch, Violet felt a hand on her shoulder. A figure leaned in to whisper into her ear. "I'll get my hands on your fortune if it's the last thing I do," the voice hissed. "And when I have it, I'll kill you and your siblings with my own 2 hands." Violet gave a little cry of horror, but flicked the switch on. The entire theater was flooded with light. Everyone blinked and looked around. Mr. Poe let go of his wife. Klaus put Sunny down, but nobody was touching Violet's shoulder. Count Olaf was gone. "Where did he go?" Mr. Poe shouted. "Where did they all go?" The Baudelaire youngsters looked around and saw that not only had Count Olaf vanished, but his accomplices, the wart-faced man, the hook-handed man, the bald man with the long nose, the enormous person who looked like neither a man nor a woman, and the 2 white-faced women had vanished along with him. "They must have run outside," Klaus said, "while it was still dark." Mr. Poe led the way outside, and just as Strauss and the children followed. Way down the block they could see a long black car driving away into the night. Maybe it contained Count Olaf and his associates. Maybe it didn't. But in any case, it turned a corner and disappeared into the dark city as the children watched without a word. "Blast it," Mr. Poe said. "They're gone. But don't worry, children, we'll catch them. I'm going to call the police immediately." Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another and knew it wasn't as simple as Mr. Poe said. Count Olaf would take care to stay out of sight as he planned his next move. He was far too clever to be captured by the likes of Mr. Poe. "Well, let's go home, children," Justice Strauss said. "We can worry about this in the morning when I've fixed you a good breakfast." Mr. Poe coughed. "Wait a minute," he said, looking down at the floor. "I'm sorry to tell you this, children, but I cannot allow you to be raised by someone who's not a relative." "What?" Violet cried. "After all Justice Strauss has done for us?" "We never would have figured out Count Olaf's plan without her in her library," Klaus said. "Without Justice Strauss, we would have lost our lives." "That may be so," Mr. Poe said, "and I thank Justice Strauss for her generosity, but your parents' will is very specific. You must be adopted by a relative. Tonight you will stay with me in my home, and tomorrow I shall go to the bank and figure out what to do with you. I'm sorry, but that is the way it is." The children looked at Justice Strauss, who sighed heavily and hugged each of the Baudelaire youngsters in turn. "Mr. Poe is right," she said sadly. "He must respect your parents' wishes. Don't you want to do what your parents wanted, children?" Violet, Klaus, and Sunny pictured their loving parents and wished more than ever that the fire had not occurred. Never had they felt so alone. They wanted very badly to live with this kind and generous woman, but they knew that it simply could not be done. "I guess you're right, Justice Strauss," Violet said finally. "We will miss you very much." "I will miss you too," she said, and her eyes filled with tears once more. Then they each gave Justice Strauss one last embrace, and followed Mr. and Mrs. Poe to their car. The Baudelaire orphans piled into the back seat and peered out the back window at Justice Strauss, who was crying and waving to them. Ahead of them were the darkened streets where Count Olaf had escaped to plan more treachery. Behind them was the kind judge who had taken such an interest in the 3 children. To Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, it seemed that Mr. Poe and the law had made the incorrect decision to take them away from the possibility of a happy life with Justice Strauss and toward an unknown fate with some unknown relative. They didn't understand it, but like so many unfortunate events in life, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it isn't so. The Baudelaires bunched up together against the cold night air and kept waving out into the back window. The car drove further and further away, until Justice Strauss was merely a speck in the darkness, and it seemed to the children that they were moving in an aberrant, the word aberrant here means very, very wrong, and causing much grief, direction. That is the end of Book 1. Here's the preview for Book 2. To my kind editor, I'm writing to you from the London branch of the Herpetological Society, where I am trying to find out what happened to the reptile collection of Dr. Montgomery following the tragic events that occurred while the Baudelaire orphans were in his care. An associate of mine will place a small waterproof box in the phone booth of the Electra Hotel at 11 p.m. next Tuesday. Please retrieve it before midnight to avoid it falling into the wrong hands. In the box, you will find my description of these terrible events entitled The Reptile Room, as well as a map of Lousy Lane, a copy of the film Zombies in the Snow, and Dr. Montgomery's recipe for coconut cream cake. I've also managed to track down one of the few photographs of Dr. Lucafont in order to help Mr. Hellquist with his illustrations. Remember, you are my last hope that the tales of the Baudelaire orphans can finally be told to the general public. With all due respect, Lemony Snicket. That's it. That's book 1 in a series of unfortunate events. Thank you guys for joining, for listening. I know this is a different style of stream, more relaxed, definitely not as busy, way more laid back, but I appreciate you guys paying attention and listening and rewatching. I'm uploading these to YouTube as I do my other game streams, so feel free to subscribe to me there to catch any that you may miss. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the night, and I will catch you again soon. Probably tomorrow I will be streaming the end of Trail of the Twister with Holland, so you guys can come back and hang out with us then. Have a wonderful night. Bye.